Ja, dann erstmal vielen Dank und guten Abend. Und ja, wie gesagt, der Vortrag ist in Englisch. Ich hoffe, das stört euch nicht zu sehr, denn das originale Skript war in Englisch und das jetzt on the fly zu übersetzen, ich glaube, dann würde ein bisschen der Flow rauskommen. Deswegen. So, good evening. I hope you have it cozy wherever you are. I'm Sebastian, better known as ASCII throughout the internet. So back in the day, I always said, yeah, well, you can find me as ASCII on Twitter. Nowadays, I'm going to say either mail me at ascidisco.com. What's in front of it is you don't need to care. Or you can find me on Blue Sky, my Twitter surrogate these days. I'm currently working as a software architect for Deutsche Telekom at the Magenta Zuhause app, which is a smart home solution. I've been working in this field for the past 12 years now. Personally, like my hobby, I'm an avid video game collector. So I almost have, I would say, nearly 1,000 video games and a couple of dozen video game consoles at home. And in the past, in the pre-pandemic years, I've also did co-found and organize a conference in Cologne, the Nightly Build conference, which was held once a year, as well as mentoring kids in the Coder Dojo, helping them getting their first steps into programming and having a bit of media awareness, which I think is quite important these days. So I'm located close to Cologne, and I would say that's everything I'm going to tell you about me, because this evening, it's not about me. It's about 3 stories I'd like to share with you. So the first one is called The Impossible. And on July 19th, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 left Denver and headed for Chicago with 285 passengers aboard. The weather was sunny and mild, with light winds out of the west at 13 miles per hour. The plane the crew and the passengers were riding that day was a DC-10, a classic plane in service at United Airlines for over 20 years. Pilots liked the model. It was an easy-to-fly one, very, very predictable. And well, honestly, you just have to admire that free-engine configuration, because that's something you don't see much these days. And over the fields of Iowa, the crew, consisting of Captain Al Haynes, First Officer Bill Rackets, and Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak, put the plane on autopilot, ate lunch, and just shot the breeze. Haynes, 57, low-key Texan and former Marine, was just 2 years shy from his retirement, and he was already planning the next stage of his life, where he would simply pilot an RV around the country with his wife, Darlene. But then, at 3:15, came a loud explosion from the tail. The plane shook fiercely, then started climbing and tilting hard to the right. Records grabbed one of the 2 control wheels, known as yokes, and said, "I have the airplane." So what happened? The disc of the rear engine had shattered. The shrapnel punctured all the hydraulic pipes, meaning primary, secondary, and tertiary systems all went out at the same time. The hydraulic pumps were flushing out all the fluids while trying to maintain pressure, and in the end, no rudders could be controlled anymore. It was like driving a car down the motorway without steering wheels and brakes. Checking the gauges, the crew realized that the plane's tail engine, one of the DC-10's 3 engines, was gone. Meanwhile, the crew were calming down the passengers. After all, they knew, the plane can fly easily with only 2 engines. It was planned with redundancy in mind. Flight might be a bit uncomfortable, but hey, absolutely no need to panic. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Al, Record said, trying to keep his voice calm, I can't control the airplane. Haynes seized the yoke. I've got it, he said. But he didn't have it. He pulled with all his strength, but the controls barely moved. The plane kept tilting to the right until it felt like it was nearly standing on its wing. He later admitted, I've got it. That was the most stupid thing he ever said. A phrase bursting out because he was the captain. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to just simply have got it. In an aisle seat of first class, 46-year-old man named Danny Finch was cleaning up the coffee he spilled on his lap when the explosion happened. Finch worked for United as a pilot trainer. He spent his days in a flight simulator teaching pilots how to handle emergencies. And now he spoke with the flight attendant and asked her to inform the captain of his willingness to help. And the word came back, send him up. Fitch walked up the aisle, opened the cockpit door, and his heart dropped. The first thing that strikes your mind is, dear God, I'm going to die this afternoon. The only question that remains is, how long is it going to take Iowa to hit me? Fitch scanned the gauges, trying to make sense of them. He had never seen a complete hydraulic failure before, and like the pilots, he was having trouble comprehending what was going on. And then he said, tell me what you want, and I'll help you. Haynes gestured to the engine throttles. Those throttles were located between the two pilots in the middle between the seats. As Haynes and Records had their hands full wrestling with the yokes, someone needed to run the throttles to maintain a level flight. Fitch moved forward, kneeled between the seats, and grasped the throttles with both hands. Shoulder to shoulder, the three men began to do something that no pilot had ever done: fly a DC-10 without any controls. But more importantly, they began to communicate in a particular way, short bursts of messages, notifications in pilot speak. Unlike commands, they carry unspoken questions like, do you agree? What else do you see? Some of those interactions consisted of big open-ended questions, mostly asked by Haynes. How do we get the landing gear down? Anybody have any ideas? And these are not the kinds of questions one would normally expect a captain to ask. In fact, they are the opposite. Normally, a captain's job in an emergency is to be in command and to project capability and coolness. Yet, over and over, Haynes notified his crew of a very different truth. Your captain has no idea what is going on or how to fix it. Can you help? Also, if you read through the transcripts, another thing will catch your eye. Captain Haynes always says, we. How are we going to solve X? Are we going to get Y done in time, etc.? Interacting in this unconfident fashion, the crew of Flight 232 solved a complex series of problems while flying at 400 miles per hour. They figured out how to optimally distribute the power between the two engines and how to try to anticipate the movements the plane was making. They communicated with the cabin, the passengers, flight control, and emergency crews on the ground. They chose routes, calculated descent rates, prepared for evacuation, and even cracked jokes. And what you see here right in front of you is the flight path the plane had taken that day. And you see the plane could only make right-hand turns. Only one time it was able to do a left-hand turn, which was brought them in the right direction onto Sioux Gateway Airport. And in the end, they managed to get the plane on the ground. And the crash was terrible. But 185 people survived, including the entire crew. Some just walked out of the wreckage into a cornfield. There was actually stories about a man who walked out of the burning plane, turned around, grabbed his suitcase, and they found him hours later at the bar in the airport. The survival of that many passengers was termed a miracle. Two, remarkably unremarkable. Back in the early part of the last century, well before Silicon Valley, the world's hub of invention and innovation was located in a series of large buildings in suburban New Jersey. It was called Bell Labs. Originally formed in 1925 to help build the US National Communications Network, Bell Labs grew into the scientific equivalent of a Renaissance-era Florence, a wellspring group of genius that lasted until the 1970s. Bell Labs and its team of scientists invented and developed the transistor, data networking, solar cells, lasers, communication satellites, binary computing, cellular communication, well, in short, most of the tools we use to live modern life. They did not produce any products themselves. They created the technology, patented it, and then licensed it out to companies that were building the actual products. And some Bell Labs administrators grew curious about the reasons for their own remarkable success. They wondered which Bell scientists had generated the most patents for their inventions, and whether those scientists had anything in common. They began, by examining the Bell patent library, and the patents there were kept in big binders organized alphabetically by the scientist's last name. Most of the binders were about the same size, but some binders stood out right away because they were fat, much fatter than anyone else's. Those were the super creative people who had filed dozens and dozens of patents. There were about roughly 10 of them. The administrators studied those 10 scientists. They were hunting for a common thread. Did the super creatives share the same specialty, the same educational background, the same family background? And after considering and discarding dozens of possible ties, they discovered a connection. And it didn't have to do with who those super creatives were. It had to do with a habit that they shared. A habit of regularly eating lunch in the Bell Labs cafeteria with a quiet Swedish engineer named Harry Nyquist. And the result came as a surprise, because in a place famous for its dynamic and eccentric leaders, Nyquist was the opposite, a mild, gently smiling person, overlooked by many. Nyquist possessed two important qualities. The first was warmth. He had a knack for making people feel cared for. Every contemporary description paints him as fatherly. The second quality was a relentless curiosity. In a landscape made up of diverse scientific domains, he combined breadth and depth of knowledge with the desire to seek connections. Nyquist was full of ideas, full of questions, Bell Labs engineer Chaplin Cutler recalls. He drew people out, got them thinking, and created a safe space for thoughts. People like Nyquist, they are polite, reserved, and skilled listeners. They radiate a safe, nurturing vibe. They possess knowledge that spans domains and have a knack for asking questions that ignite motivation and ideas. They form bonds, teams, and make them stick. These days, especially in IT, we call these people glue workers. Simply put, glue work puts the health of the team ahead of the individual accomplishments. It is core to the success of individual projects. In detail, it's about cross-functional collaboration, building a culture of partnership and communicating well, ensuring smooth team functioning, interviewing and onboarding new team members, unblocking teammates, and designing new processes. The necessary but, well, less exciting parts of the jobs, responding to ad hoc questions and inbound requests, documentation, scheduling meetings, etc. Well, the whole topic can be a talk on its own, and it has. And I highly recommend Tanya Riley's talk and her blog posts on that particular subject. The key role of Nyquist and others like him spiked the interest of Will Phelps, who studied organizational behavior at the University of South Wales in Australia. He set out to create an experiment called the Bad Apples. Phelps brought in an actor to portray three negative archetypes: the jerk, the slacker, and the downer, inside 40 four-person groups tasked with constructing a marketing plan for a startup. The actor, let's name him Andy, is really good at being bad. In almost every group, his behavior reduces the quality of the group's performance by 30 to 40%. The drop-off is consistent whenever he plays the jerk, the slacker, or the downer. When Andy is the downer, everybody comes into the meeting really energized. He acts quiet and tired, and at some point puts his head down on his desk. And then, as the time goes by, they all start to behave that way, tired and quiet and low energy. By the end, there are three others with their heads down on the desks like him, all with their arms folded, Phelps says. When Andy plays the slacker, a similar pattern occurs. The group quickly picks up his vibe, Phelps says. They get done with the project very quickly and they do a half-assed job. What's interesting, though, is that when you ask them about it afterwards, they are very positive on the surface. They say, we did a good job, we enjoyed it. But it isn't true. They picked up the attitude that this project really didn't matter. It wasn't worth their time or their energy. I'd gone in expecting that someone in the group would get upset with the slacker or the downer, but nobody did. They were like, okay, if that's how it is, then we'll all be slackers or downers too. Except for one group. It's the outlier group, Phelps says. They first came to my attention when Andy mentioned that there was one group that felt really different to him. This group performed well no matter what he did. Andy said it was mostly because of one guy. You can see this guy causing Andy to get almost infuriated. His negative moves aren't working like they had in the other groups, because this guy could find a way to flip it and engage everyone, get people moving towards the goal. Let's call him Ron. Despite Andy's efforts, Ron's group is attentive and energetic, and they produce high-quality results. The more fascinating part, at least from Phelps' view, is that at first glance, Ron doesn't seem to be doing anything at all. A lot of it is really simple stuff that is almost invisible at first. Andy would start being a jerk, and Ron would lean forward, use body language, laugh, smile, in a way that takes the danger out of the room and diffuses the situation. Basically, Ron makes it safe, then turns to the other people and asks, hey, what do you think of this? Sometimes he even asks Andy questions like, how would you do that? But most of all, he radiates an idea that is something like, hey, this is all really comfortable and engaging, and I'm curious about what everybody else has to say. It was amazing how such simple, small behaviors kept everybody engaged on the task. Even Andy, almost against his will, found himself being helpful. Ron succeeds without taking any of the actions we normally associate with a strong leader. He doesn't take charge or tell anyone what to do. He doesn't strategize, motivate, or lay out a vision. He doesn't perform so much as create conditions for others to perform, constructing an environment whose key feature is crystal clear. We are solidly connected. Ron's group succeeds not because its members are smarter, but because they are safer. Free. 311 words. In 1943, Robert Wood Johnson, the company's chairman and member of the founding family of Pharma Corp Johnson & Johnson, wrote a one-page document, better known as the Credo. It is a value statement, a solid one, displayed in the entrance area of every Johnson & Johnson office worldwide. It reads a bit like this. We believe our first responsibility is to doctors, nurses, and patients, to mothers and fathers, and all others who use our products and services. In meeting their needs, everything we do must be of high quality. Actions must be just and ethical. 30 years later, in 1975, James Burke, then president of Johnson & Johnson, noticed that the Credo didn't seem to matter that much anymore to many employees. And what was more, he wasn't sure that it should matter. Times had changed. Many of the Johnson & Johnson employees felt that it was just kind of a public relations gimmick. It wasn't a unifying document anymore. Burke's idea was to hold a meeting to determine the role that the Credo had in the company's future. When he proposed his idea, many of Johnson & Johnson's leaders rejected it outright. To question such a foundational document seemed like a waste of time. Dick Sellers, chairman of the board at the time, called the notion ridiculous. He told Burke that challenging the Credo would be like a Catholic deciding to challenge the Pope. I challenge the Pope every day when I wake up, Burke said in response. I think at times he's crazy. I think at times my religion is nuts. Of course I challenge it. Everybody challenges their values, and that's what we ought to do with the Credo. And he prevailed. After the managers took their seats, Burke outlined their task. You guys are in a position of being able to challenge this document, which is the heart and soul of this corporation. And if you can't live by its principles, we ought to tear it off the walls, because it's an act of pretension to leave it there. And if you want to change it, tell us how it ought to be changed. He repeated this meeting on all levels of the company, over and over. And the challenges seemed to work. He and others sensed that employees seemed to have a fresh awareness of the Credo. But of course, these kinds of things are mostly intangible, difficult to measure in normal course of life. Seven years later, on September 30th, 1982, normal life came to an abrupt halt. Burke received a phone call that 6 people were dead in Chicago because they had ingested his company's product, extra-strength Tylenol capsules that had been laced with cyanide by a blackmailer. In a few hours, Johnson & Johnson went from a provider of medicine to being a provider of poison. The atmosphere at the headquarters was a mix of shock and disbelief. The company was not equipped to deal with this crisis. 4 days after the poisonings, Burke and other members met with the FBI to discuss strategy. It was recommended by the FBI to only pull Tylenols from stores in Chicago, though there where the deaths happened. Burke thought about it and decided against. It cost the company over $100 million, in 1975 money that is, to pull Tylenol from all the stores across the US. Over the next days and weeks, Johnson & Johnson essentially transformed itself from a pharmaceutical company into a public safety organization. It designed and manufactured innovative tamper-proof packaging, developed exchange, disposal, and refund programs, and built public safety ones. And then something unexpected happened. Tylenol's market share, after dropping to 0 after the attacks, began to slowly climb back to previous levels and even continued to grow. One paper termed it the greatest comeback since Lazarus. In the following years, Johnson & Johnson's response has become the gold standard for handling corporate crises. While looking for a credo of some sort within our domain, our IT domain that is, I remembered something that got stuck in my head more than a decade ago. A certain abstract from the HTML design principles document that I repeat in my mind ever since, that I try to apply whenever in doubt. And it reads like this. In case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity. Users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity. Whenever I find myself in conversation about whether to use framework X or Y, Postgres or over MySQL as a database, Java or JavaScript, pattern X or pattern Y, you name it. I try to remember this, and that all of this technical-driven discussion is mostly pointless. We aim to build something for our users. May it be customers, may it be colleagues who have to work with it in the future, or may it be even our future selves. It's not about the how, it's about the why and the whom. Whom we do this for, and why do we do it? And so far, we focused on 3 seemingly unrelated stories. We've seen how small signals, you are safe, we share risk here, connect people and enable them to work together as a single entity. But I guess now it's the time to ask, hey, Sebastian, what's all this for? What are we working towards here? And in the weeks after the crash of Flight 232, as part of the investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board placed experienced crews in simulators and recreated the conditions faced by Flight 232 at the moment it lost all hydraulics. The simulation was run 28 times, and all 28 times the planes crashed, spiraling to the ground without getting close to the airport. All of which underlines a strange truth. The crew of Flight 232 succeeded not because of their individual skills, but because they were able to combine those skills into a greater intelligence. They demonstrated that a series of small, humble exchanges, anybody have any ideas, tell me what you want and I'll help you, can unlock a group's ability to perform. The key involves the willingness to perform a certain behavior that goes against our every instinct. Sharing vulnerability. Harry Nyquist sure was an accomplished researcher and engineer, but his greatest accomplishment, at least in my opinion, was his impact on the people surrounding him. I believe he mostly succeeded because he was crucial in building a safe environment within Bell Labs, where people freely shared their ideas without fear. When James Burke was asked for his reasoning behind the decision of pulling 31 million pills from the shelves, costing the company $100 million, the answer came quickly. We believe our first responsibility is to doctors, nurses, and patients, to mothers and fathers, and all others who use our products and services. We had to make hundreds of decisions on the fly. Hundreds of people made thousands of decisions, Burke said afterwards. If you look back, we didn't make any bad decisions, really. We really didn't. Those thousands of decisions all had a splendid consistency about them. And that was what the public was going to be served first, because that's who was at stake. So the reason people talk about Tylenol when the credo discussions come up is that the credo ran that, because the hearts and minds of the people who were at Johnson & Johnson and who were making the decisions in a whole series of disparate companies, they all knew what to do. Johnson & Johnson's credo the discussions they have and had about its contents made one thing clear. Berg enabled all of Johnson & Johnson's employees to react in a consistent manner. He gave them the power to make their own decisions because he knew they were going to make the right ones. Essentially, I believe it's best summarized by Berg and the Credo established purpose in the hearts, souls, and minds of Johnson & Johnson's employees. So for a long time, when I heard phrases like culture grows from the bottom up and our company culture is, I don't know, you name it, I did think of it as meaningless buzzword bullshit bingo. I did understand the intention, but I did not get it. I had to approach the meaning of company or team culture from a very different angle, by listening to and reading about stories which fundamentally told me about why it matters, not just stating that it does. And to me, it means the following: to enable and be enabled, to empower and be empowered, to feel safe and to create safe spaces, to create work with purpose, to create purpose for others, to share vulnerability and to create a space where people feel safe to share theirs. That is culture. And this is what I want to see in my place of work. And you might still feel the same about it as I once did. But if you spare out the marketing flair of culture grows from the bottom up, then you might also find an essential truth in it, that we shape the work, we work together, that we, each and every one of us, on their own, can decide how we treat others, how we interact with each other, and therefore determine the culture we build for ourselves. And with that, I would say story time is over. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to any discussion that will come up.